taxonomy. I've probably done some people a disservice by putting them in certain places in there in terms of their presentations. In fact, Deborah, I think yours was only 2, and I'll put it down as cross-sectional. I went from the abstract, and that's what I could gain. But you know, you've got modelling here, and all of these are probably important to give an overall picture of what constructs we're really seeking to influence in interventions that involve psychology, at least, with people for behaviour change. So you've got cross-sectional modelling, you've got longitudinal modelling. We've got a couple of examples there where James brought in environmental variables in addition to psychological variables. He reminded us that it's not just about psychology. Then you've got efficacy testing and proof of concept studies, which is what we used to do. We've done a lot of modelling in exercise psychology, for example, and we've taken various ideas through efficacy testing. And it's when we get really into delivering interventions out there in the real world it gets tricky. And we've had 3 papers there, at least in part, looked at how we try to use theory to design practical, pragmatic strategies for delivery in the real world setting. And that's more challenging. And we've got examples here from Pedro. Well, Pedro covered all of those in one presentation, I think, on actually testing an intervention to see if it works as well. It's got pretty good evidence that self-determination theory-based work does make a difference in terms of success for weight management and physical activity. And similarly, Ron focused on mediators to try to find out what the reasons for change were. So all of those are very important, and they should all continue. It's not the whole story of public health, it goes further. Yes, we started with this simple model here of efficacy studies where we just threw an intervention package in, mainly exercise physiologists who did this work. There was no behaviour change in there, you just worked them, you trained them to see if they did good things in physical activity. Then we started to bring on psychosocial states and try to influence their states in order to change physical activity behaviour. So intervention packages such as the ones we've described today made a difference. So we based those on theoretical frameworks. And here you've got an example running through it. Here's a motivational theory, self-perception theory, for example. It tells us what the target constructs are. Well, it's what you think about yourself. If you can change what people think about themselves, does that actually influence their physical activity patterns through building confidence and so on. So that model is very useful, and we've done quite a bit of that. And some good examples today where we use theory to identify constructs, we measure them, and we build strategies on those constructs to try to change behaviour at the end of the day. Okay? And I think we need more and more of that. But it's not the only story. In true public health settings, it's not just important to help people change behaviour. You've got to change the behaviour of the right kind of people. And you need to focus on health-needy people. And they're often a challenging population. Health-needy people are often lower SES status, not as well educated, they have a cluster of bad behaviours. And so the issue of recruitment now starts to become of primary significance. Because if you get the wrong people in your interventions, you can actually cause greater health inequalities by attracting the very well, the well-educated, and they're the ones that are easy to attract into your interventions. So we also need to focus on how to recruit the right kind of population into study. So studying recruitment becomes an important issue as well, and we need to apply theory to figure out how we can develop strategies to recruit the needy people into our interventions. And the full model is really quite complicated with all these kinds of questions. Did we recruit the right kind of people? Do we retain them? Can we keep them in the interventions? Which bits work best for each participant? And what about professionals as well? How do they react to the intervention? Did they deliver what they were intended to deliver? Did they deliver it well at the same time? So there are all these kinds of things here that need to be included in public health settings as well, and we're not really tackling all of them at the moment. So if we add to the bottom a couple more, theory to increase recruitment and compliance, that's just as important, and theory to improve intervention delivery as well. So that's a full picture of what we might be looking at. So finally, some of the challenges in public health settings are measurement. You get very little chance to ask a lot of questions in interventions, and questionnaires that are long-winded and of the wrong language are not going to get introduced because you have a one-shot approach often. You don't get too much opportunity to ask all the questions that theorists would like to be able to ask to answer their questions. So often a menu of best strategies is needed, as I tried to make in my presentation, where you choose the bits that are appropriate for that particular population. And finally, what we really have to do to survive in the public health world is to explain more variance. We have to find ways of producing strategies that really can have a useful success rate if we're going to continue to be involved in this field of work. So, thank you very much.
Any quick question or two for Cam? Dave?
If we're going to apply an existing theory to retention, which is obviously an issue of retention and recruitment, would you have what would be your best bet? What would you
Well, I think it's very difficult to give you a straightforward answer. Obviously we need one. But it depends on the population. It depends on the setting. And there are so many different kinds of interventions that we could talk about with different populations. So if I want to draw in older people aged 75 to 80 into an intervention, you know, I've got to consider their needs, their particular needs and their interests and their what they want from the intervention. So if it's physical function that they really want out of it, then I would focus the intervention on to trying to help them experience better physical function in the hope that that would get buy-in from that particular kind of person. So I think theories that are based largely on fulfilling personal needs, whether they're psychological or physical at the time, have the highest potential to retain, because you get buy-in. People are going to get something out of it, more likely to be retained in the intervention. That's a fairly simple, generalised answer. You'd have to change that across different needs for different populations. I think Pedro's comment about SDT being very generalisable is true because it has very strong humanistic principles underpinning it. I think that's why it's so popular. It's based largely on satisfying psychological needs. So I think those are likely to work best.
Good question and great answer. So I'm sure there'll be some of that maybe a little bit later. Okay, Stuart. Oh, okay, sure.
Just to pick up on your point before, the question, which leads well into what I plan to highlight, which are just a few, maybe 3 or 4 limitations of our current work that I think that if we reflect further on them, maybe help us move forward. But we have talked about psychological theories, and I think there will never be a psychological theory that fully that accounts for a very large variance of our behavior. We live in complex environments. We are influenced by all sorts of determinants, and so sometimes it appears as if we are predicting, but based on these theories, that are predicting very, very small amounts of variance in behavior. And I will show you in a second an example of a study which has integrated multiple levels of influences on behavior. You can see how the predictive variance increases substantially. However, I think theory-based research is very important to make our interventions more cost-effective, to discard components of interventions that are proven not to be useful, and this has ethical implications as well, as we cannot keep on spending money in studies and interventions that have largely redundant effects. And also for the improvement of theory itself, for the improvement of science, and how people operate in the world. So my first theme, or my first idea, is just to highlight the importance of intervention research in this area. We've all heard of these theories before, and we may get the impression that there's been a lot of intervention research conducted in some of these theories, these more popular theories that we've heard, such as social cognitive theory, or theory of planned behavior, or self-determination theory. However, there hasn't been really that much experimental research. And experimental research is really what gets us into exploring change. Many of these theories have looked at the level of behavior, or whether a person is active or not active, but very few have really looked at the processes of change and looked at predictors of change in time. And so that's really the key interest for practice. To see if the theory constructs are malleable, if they can change. Also to provide obviously temporal sequence between intervention and the behavior change. And most importantly, because only intervention research, or primarily intervention research, are we able to test for mediation effects. And we've seen a couple of examples here. Let me just highlight that to you. This is a recent review. It has changed a bit. This is already a few years old, or a couple of years old. But looking at social cognitive theory studies, and in physical activity in healthy adults. So you would think that there would be a lot of studies looking at mediation based on this theory. And what you see is that only 6 studies out there, at least at the time it applies to the theory of planned behavior, which at the point of this review had virtually no studies using longitudinal designs exploring mediation. And it also applies to to self-determination theory in a sense. These are just some of the studies that are available. Not that few, and as you can see, not that many. As you can see, they're coming from very different settings. So we really need to build up the base of experimental research, theory-based experimental research, before we can reach any conclusions about the usefulness of some of these theories. So that was the first point I wanted to make. And we've seen a nice example before. This is another example of how you can actually test whether a theory is being properly employed in a study. Before I move into that topic, just another quick note on the limitations of linear models that we use for some of these studies. For many studies you've noticed that we use minutes of physical activity as the outcome variable. And our variables predict variance of minutes of physical activity. If you think about it, there's nothing intrinsically sound about predicting that someone who say, uses or employs 220 minutes of physical activity should have more self-efficacy than someone that reports just 200 minutes of physical activity. Our psychology is not necessarily supposed to work this way. However, this is the assumption that we use in some of these studies. We assume the linearity of the relationship between the predictor and the outcome. So, in designing a study, we might very well look for an outcome, a dichotomous outcome, that is sufficiently satisfying from a health perspective or another perspective, and see to the extent that that model predicts, say, level above, or physical activity above a certain level. But the models that you've seen, including my own, are linear models. They are predicting minutes of physical activity. And so there's an inherent limitation in that as well. Another point is, as I said before, trying to integrate different levels. And this is just a project, a European project, that is trying to do exactly that, to integrate different levels from the environmental influences, social influences, psychological or individual level influences, and so forth. And this great study that just came out from the Deacon group shows how this can be tested. And this is a cross-sectional design from a large population of lower economical status women, and see how they integrated built environment variables into the model. And this is just for physical activity. The model actually continued for BMI on this side, but I'm just showing you just an example of built environmental model variables, social environment variables, motivational variables, in this case adopting social cognitive theory perspective on behavior, in this case, but leisure time, physical activity, and also post-motivational variables, so skills, behavioral skills that were also predicted for behavior. And the study was able to predict 82% of the variance in minutes of physical activity again. So you can see how we need to really move forward from simple or single level models to multiple levels of behavior. My final point has to do with moving beyond behavior change. I was walking here and I was thinking, I had this thought experiment as I was walking through the bridge before, thinking, what if a year from now everybody's doing physical activity? We succeeded. The people in this meeting achieved their goal. We succeeded. People were active in large numbers. Then what? What would we do? Play golf? Play golf is actually a nice answer. It's just a thought experiment, unfortunately. I don't think we're going to get to that point in a year from now. But if we did, what would be our next purpose? And I was trying to think about it. And my guess is that we might want to go two ways. One is to try to predict the maintenance of that behavior. And you can see how maintenance of behavior is really a different goal than just changing the behavior from inactive to active, for instance. And another goal I think, is to move beyond behavior. And if everybody was physically active, what would be the kind of questions that we would ask? And my guess is that the kind of question would be active for what? What is physical activity bringing to people's lives? And how can our interventions maximize on those, on the potential for physical activity to actually add quality, not just health necessarily, but quality to people's lives? Meaning, meaningful social interactions, self-expression, fun and joy, and so forth. And I think with a lot of the theories that we use, we are missing on this aspect of physical activity, the contribution that it can make to a better and richer and more meaningful life. And so this is one thing that I like about self-determination theory, is that it does make predictions about not only behavior change, but also about what the experts call psychological well-being, psychological wellness, or also mental health outcomes, but also more meaningful outcomes which are derived from the satisfaction of one's psychological needs. So it's supposed to improve the quality of the behavior, but also improve the quality of our experiences in the behavior. So thus, the experiential component that is embedded within this theory is quite unique, I think. So just a few issues, and maybe we can discuss them further. Thank
you. Any quick question or follow-up points? I certainly have a few things I'd like to maybe comment on, and maybe in our final wrap-up. Thanks very much. A lot of good ideas. And finally, Stuart. No slides.
That's the best slide so far, yeah? Yours are great. I decided to break the habit of a lifetime. So I'm just going to make a few brief comments, briefer than my two esteemed colleagues. It's also a show, okay. So the first thing is quite interesting that I think Pedro and maybe Ken as well said that these theories are psychological theories, and we have been talking about psychological theories in this session, but the session is actually titled Theory, not Psychological Theory. So my first point is, where are the other theories? Where are the environmental, organisational, sociological, social theories? Well, they're there, of course. In fact, if you go to the intervention mapping book and the subsequent edition of that, the theories are outlined superbly in these other areas. I remember saying this in a lecture about 5 or 6 years ago. I listed a lot of the theories in social and environmental and organisational settings, none of which I'd ever heard of. they're all in that book, and they're all to inform health behaviour change. So I think my first point, as much as I'm in favour of these theories, by the way, that I don't disagree with anything that's been said about or the need to apply social cognitive, self-determination theory and so on, and I've invested a lot of my career in those kind of things, but I still think we're missing something. Now, it's interesting that when you do get to sit down or stand up to talk to sociologists or other ologists, there seems to be a complete miss of language. There is for me anyway. And occasionally I have to talk to PhD students at Loughborough in other areas, end-of-year assessments and things like that, where we have this panel discussion. And I might go in as the independent assessor to see that their progress is satisfactory. And I'm engaging with somebody who's interested in physical activity for health, but from a sociological point of view. And we're just talking completely different languages. And we actually don't see things philosophically the same anyway. So where are we getting that into this theory? Have they got something to offer? If so, where are they? Particularly in terms of perhaps environment, social context, social class. Because these are things that they deal with on a day-to-day basis. And I'm not just talking about sociology, that's just an example. So that leads me to my next related point, which is, have we become too individualistic? We've said this for many years, actually, in psychology. Have we become too individualistic in our orientation? And have we become too wrapped up in conscious processing of attitudes, motives, desires, outcome, expectations, and so on? And what's really prompted my thinking in this in the last few years is working more and more in sedentary behaviour. And for those of you who were in the sedentary behaviour satellite meeting this morning, I'll repeat my little example because I do it every time. And that is, when you walked into this room, how many of you consciously thought, shall I sit or shall I stand? Because that's the health behaviour. Now, you are a biased group. There are a lot of people standing in this room, a lot more than you get in your student lectures back at your universities. But when I raise that issue to my students, they look at me as if I'm a bit mad. They look at me because I'm mad anyway, but they certainly do when I say, did you consciously process that? So they say, well, what do you mean? I say, well, isn't it an habitually driven behaviour whether you sit or stand? You come in, this is a lecture room, chairs are provided, therefore you sit and you don't even think about it. So how are we going to break that, what is essentially an habitual behaviour that has been reinforced time and time again in a social context that you repeat on many occasions? Well, you modify the environment. Now, you might also raise consciousness through things like common sense model and trans-theoretical model by informing people that actually prolonged sitting may not be very good for you. Because they might say, oh, I haven't really thought of that, I've never heard that before. Okay, so you're raising consciousness, but the environment might actually immediately solve the problem, at least in the short term. So my point is, where's the study of habituation, and are we over-egging the conscious processing models that we come across? And I'm not suggesting that what we've heard in all these presentations, those theories are not appropriate. They might be wholly appropriate for those behaviours. I'm beginning to think that for some sedentary behaviours, the habitual processing and the less conscious processing is perhaps as important, if not more important. And that could be for certain nutrition behaviours as well. So it might be very context and behaviour specific, but something to think about. Okay, so I've made that point, and I've made that point, and so my final point is that and building again on a couple of issues that have already been raised, and that is this idea of theoretical constructs mediating behaviour change. And it's just an old chestnut for me, is when we write up these interventions, can we have more process evaluations, and can journal editors allow for that? I mean, it is getting a lot better, there's no doubt about it, but I'm still hearing, even at this meeting, about systematic reviews of interventions where they still can't really fathom out what the interventions were about and what happened, even though we have methods, papers. Do we have intervention manuals that we could look at? So it's more qualitative process evaluation stuff would still be very, very important. But I had a thought, does the fact that we're using theory in that case negate more bottom-up approaches? Aren't we supposed to go to the participants and ask them what they want and how they want to go about it? And, but by the way, you've got to do it by social cognitive theory. And I was remembering a student of mine many years ago, really interested in theory of planned behaviour, and he went out onto the streets of this very low socioeconomic status area and thought, I'm going to test theory of planned behaviour and ask all these wonderfully academic questions. And the first question was, you know, about your attitude towards physical activity, and some bloke said, you want me to be more physically active? Get the dog shit off the pavement. That was the answer. And you suddenly think, oh, maybe they're thinking about this slightly differently than we are. So, you know, where does the theory fit in? Does it allow these participants to input to the intervention, bottom-up approach which we all advocate? Well, where does the theory then come in? Do we still have the theory, or do we bring that in later and tailor it to what they think is acceptable? Okay, so that's me done. So, Rob, shall we throw that open for discussion?
Absolutely, yes.
I apologise for the swear word, but it